Hi, this is Mark Ryman with the Monsanto Learning Center in Gothenburg, Nebraska. And today in our irrigation series, we're going to focus on the different ways to irrigate. First, it's important to understand a little bit about irrigation's background, though. It's been around about 8,000 years, and probably ever since someone noticed that putting water on dry crops improve yields. What you notice throughout history is that civilizations really developed around land that was fit for irrigation. You can think of areas like Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley. The other thing to note about irrigation, and really its importance, is it dramatically improves yields and crop quality, making it a more stable food production environment for early civilizations, and even making it that way today. One example of that is where I grew up in north central Nebraska. This table just shows dryland and irrigated yields. In drought years like 2002 and 2012, we got about 200 extra bushels of corn and about 60 extra bushels of soybeans per acre because of irrigation. In a more normal year, you still end up with 80 bushels to around 20 bushels of soybeans extra yield from irrigation. Another important thing about irrigation is it's one of those factors that's really allowing steady increases to food production, but allowing land use to stay stable. This chart just highlights an example of that, where you're comparing food production, population, and land use. As you can see, food production is steeply increasing, especially in the last 20 years, while land use is relatively flat and even expected to decrease over the next 100 years. In the meantime, food production is expected to increase dramatically. One of the things making that possible is irrigation. And while we haven't added a lot of cropland acres, we have been increasing the number of irrigated acres from about 15 million in the 1930s to 56 million where we are today. And as I showed earlier, irrigation does bring with it increases in crop yields on the same area of land. To allow this increase in irrigation, one of the big changes is what's happened with our water source. Primarily, we used to rely on surface water for irrigation. You had to divert water from rivers and then move it into canals, through laterals into fields, all of which were pretty expensive and sometimes inefficient irrigation projects. In about the 1930s to 1940s, another source was developed, and this was groundwater. The development of deep well turbine pumps really enabled us, especially on the high plains, to access water in deep aquifers that we could never reach before, allowing us to irrigate more acres of land. That background in the history of irrigation and the different water sources we use really lead us to the three different types of irrigation we commonly see. Gravity irrigation is one, as its name implies. It really relies on gravity to move the water through the field. Sprinkler irrigation tries to sprinkle the water on like rain, and we actually have to use pressurized water. And then micro irrigation also uses pressurized water, but it's a very efficient method, usually the water coming out in small amounts. And if you take the top 10 irrigated states and look at the different types of irrigation there, you can really see that some states are dominated by sprinkler irrigation, some are dominated by gravity irrigation, and then you do have an influence working in there in the green bars of some micro irrigation, particularly in states like California and Washington where they have a lot of specialty crops, and some in Texas where they have the need for a greater use of water use efficiency. And when it comes to the application efficiency of irrigation systems, surface irrigations have that lowest application efficiency. Typically, we'd say in a range of 45 to 80%, but usually we use the number 50%. And the 80% only comes with, use tailwater reuse or surge irrigation. Then you've got sprinkler irrigation systems that are really in that range of 75 to 90% efficient. 75% would be on the low end, and 90 would be if you're using some of the best water saving practices to make that system efficient. And then on the really efficient side of things, you can talk about subsurface drip tape. It can be 95% plus efficient, and that's mainly because you apply that water through the drip tape and it doesn't actually get to the surface where it can evaporate. So that leads to added application efficiency. Keeping those efficiencies in mind, we'll talk about the three different types of irrigation. The first one we're going to discuss is gravity irrigation. Although it's not as efficient typically in water use, it is efficient in terms of equipment cost. One of the simplest forms of gravity irrigation is what we call border irrigation. And that's really just kind of flooding across the field. You don't have furrows or other things like that dug usually. And it's really used in solid seeded crops. You just kind of let the water move in and flow across. It requires very level fields, but it's useful in crops like alfalfa, wheat, barley, rice, things that are solid seeded. Another common form of gravity irrigation is called furrow irrigation. It's really used a lot in row crops and requires the use of what we call a hiller to make a furrow between the crop rows. There's a few different forms of furrow irrigation that are common. The first one is what we call open ditch irrigation. This is used a lot where we have surface water distribution systems and you don't have to add extra pressure. You simply have a canal or a lateral at one end of the field, and then you use siphon tubes or some other method to move the water from that ditch and down the furrows that are between the crops. It's a pretty ineffective way in terms of labor, but it doesn't have a lot of cost to it. Another common type of gravity irrigation is furrow irrigation with gated pipe. It uses the same furrows down the crop rows as you saw with ditch irrigation, but instead of an open ditch at the end of the field, it actually uses gated pipe to distribute the water. The water has to be pressurized by some type of pump, but then you can open and close the gates to choose the crop rows that the water actually flows down. It has a little bit more of an equipment requirement because you do have to have a pump and you do have to lay out the pipe, but overall it's a good system. Another option that you have with gravity irrigation is furrow irrigation with polytube. Again, it uses the same furrows, but instead of a rigid plastic or aluminum pipe, it actually uses a thin-walled plastic tubing that you lay out every year. And instead of gates, in a lot of cases, you simply poke holes in that polytubing at the specified intervals to allow the water out to reach your crop. And at the end of the season, you simply roll up that plastic tubing and take it to recycling. So it has some pretty good advantages in not having to store irrigation pipe all year. Those are just a few of the gravity irrigation techniques, but some of those that are common in the United States. The next main type of irrigation is sprinkler irrigation. And as we saw, this one was more efficient than the gravity irrigation that came before it. The first sprinkler irrigation really had some humble beginnings in terms of it might be nothing more than impact sprinklers mounted at the tops of pipes that were distributed throughout the field to irrigate it. You could also mount these on movable pipe, but either way there was a lot of labor and a pretty high equipment cost to irrigating small amounts of land. To address the moving by hand, side roll irrigation systems were developed. These are essentially impact sprinklers on a pipe that were mounted on wheels that could use water pressure to help themselves travel across the field. It was much better than moving it by hand, but it still had low clearance and managed mostly alfalfa fields, hay meadows, and small grains. Sprinkler irrigation really took off in the late 1950s with the development of center pivot irrigation. It's a little bit like side roll irrigation in that it has wheels, but in this case it's mounted around a center point and is really designed to have higher clearance. That higher clearance is really facilitated by A-frame towers where the water pipe is actually carried across the top of those towers. The two tires at the bottom provide the mobility of the system, and it's such a strong structure that it can even go over very hilly ground and still keep in line and do a good job of watering your field. Another important part of watering the field properly is having nozzles on it that can distribute the water evenly. And farmers have a lot of choices in how they can outfit nozzles on a center pivot. The first type would be impact sprinklers. They're the oldest. They have the widest throw, but they do require a lot of pressure, and so they're inefficient in terms of energy use. A more efficient type would be spray nozzles that are mounted on top of the pivot or spray nozzles that are mounted at truss rod height on a drop. Further efficiencies can be gained from LPIC, which are low pressure in canopy nozzles, LISA, which is low elevation spray application nozzles, and LIPA nozzles, which are low energy precision application nozzles. All these have different uses and need to be spaced differently to do a proper job of irrigating with them, but they all have their fit in the irrigation world. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of the different types of sprinkler irrigation you'll see out there. For instance, I skipped over traveling gun irrigation, which is a large gun type irrigator moving through the field, but these are the common ones you'll see out there. The third and final type of irrigation is micro-irrigation. We're going to focus on surface drip irrigation and subsurface drip irrigation. They have similar components. First is a valve that is often run either manually or electrically that can be turned on to allow water into the main line. The main line then distributes that water to the irrigation tubes. The irrigation tubes are just long plastic tubes that have what are called emitters on them. And the emitter isn't just a small hole poked in plastic tubing, as the term drip irrigation might make you think. It's actually a highly engineered system that allows the water to move out of that hole in the irrigation tubing at a specific rate. It also prevents clogging so that the hole can't get plugged, and it prevents things like root intrusion from causing problems for the system. And after the plastic tubing, you have what's called the drip irrigation flush end. And that flush end, you can just open up a valve, and it's what lets you move debris and other materials out of that irrigation system periodically. It keeps it from clogging up and keeps the system in good operating shape. Another important thing with drip irrigation is really a high-quality filtration system. Oftentimes, you'll see things like sand filtration or really fine screens that prevent sand and other particles from going out and clogging it. It's something you have to be concerned about. Even though the emitters are designed very well, you don't want to cause the opportunity for them to clog up. And those are some components of micro irrigation, specifically using drip tape. There's a few different ways of using drip tape. One of those is what we call surface drip tape, and that's laying it on the surface along with the main line and flush end. We do use it in some circumstances here, and you might see it out there in the field where for some reason maybe a permanent install with subsurface drip isn't desirable. The other option is what we call subsurface drip tape, and this involves burying that drip tape, the plastic tubing, below the surface of the soil. Sometimes it's only a few inches deep, or it can get down to as many as 12 to 14 inches like we have in our subsurface installs here at the Learning Center. As I mentioned, it's a very efficient way of using water because the water slowly drips out of those emitters, wets the soil around the tape, but it doesn't reach the surface where it can evaporate. So unless you're over-irrigating and causing water to percolate, it should be moving through your crops. And the drip tape irrigation systems are by no means the only type of micro-irrigation. There's also sprinklers and bubblers and lots of specialty systems for different crops and different applications. One interesting development in micro-irrigation is that people are figuring out how to put drip tape behind center pivot irrigation systems instead of nozzles. This essentially allows what was a sprinkler system to become a mobile micro irrigation system in your fields. And it's just another example of how irrigation technologies are always changing. So in closing, we talked about gravity irrigation, specifically furrow irrigation and border irrigation, sprinkler irrigation with the different methods there, and then micro irrigation, which are all ways that farmers to use to irrigate their crops. Thank you, and I look forward to visiting with you in the future more about irrigation topics.
For more information on this topic, you can download the Monsanto Irrigation Handbook for the Great Plains by using the following address. You can also download a specific research report by visiting the Gothenburg Learning Center website. This video was produced by the Monsanto Water Utilization Learning Center.